is kind of what either of
You
these
can
is
continue, Nandita. Sorry, I was a
okay.
misunderstanding, and we wanted to record the lecture, but forget
Oh no,
about
no,
it.
no, it's
So
okay.
please go ahead.
So yeah, what I was saying is that what both these discourses do is kind of reinforce rather racist or xenophobic tendencies towards migrants. And here, what Andrew Baldwin brings in is a very crucial perspective of looking at it through critical race theory. So whether you look at the climate migrant as a potential threat or a potential victim, they have the same effect of racializing the migrant. So, whether the migrant body is a threat or a victim, you are marking them as the other from a normal body that is neither a threat nor a victim. And by doing so, what you're also doing is asking for some sort of moral intervention. Now, that moral intervention could come in the form of saying we need to securitize our borders, or it could come in the form of saying we need to help those poor victims out there who are suffering from, who are going to be the victims of climate change and migration. So either way, it cannot be what Baldwin is saying is that either way, whichever discourse, whether it's a securitarian discourse or a humanitarian discourse, it has the same effect of racializing the climate migrant and asking for some kind of intervention from the people that are then not racialized. And more often than not, this kind of discourse also expresses a set of white anxieties to do with the impending loss of control and the dissolution of borders. And what happens when Tuvalu drowns and all these people lose their political status as citizens? What do we do with these people then who lie in this ambiguous zone of not having any political status, not having any citizenship? So very often, like again, they take us back to these questions of border, of us and them, of how to somehow be able to maintain these borders and stop those people from infiltrating our territories. And moving on to spaces, I also find it very productive to think of the geographies of climate migration, or rather, the geographies that are said to engender climate mobilities in the future or in the present, to think of them as imaginaries, right? So often we talk about climate migration in spatial terms, whether we are talking about hotspots of climate migration or sinking islands or Africa as the global hotspot of climate migration. We are spatializing this kind of migration. We are assigning it a certain geography in which it will occur. And often these are not factual kind of specialities or geographies, but they are spatial imaginaries. In representing climate migration, they're also performing and enacting this discourse. And that is not to say, that is to say that these are not merely representational discourses, but they're also shaping the material geography. And in the next slide, I'll say how. Um, and what they're also doing is creating like a here and there, right? So if climate migration happens in Africa, then the question is where would those migrants go to? And the answer often, or the imaginary often is, well, they'll go to Europe. And what also happens when you think of them in terms of imaginaries is you begin to see like the dominant imaginaries and the minor imaginaries, and how it's the dominant imaginaries that circulate as facts and even get accepted as facts after a certain amount of circulation. And that leaves very little room for alternative imaginaries to arise and to compete with them. This is all very abstract, but I'll kind of give an example. So because we spoke before about Tuvalu, so if you kind of look at the same example as a spatial imaginary, so the dominant imaginary that you'll encounter in academic literature, in often media representation, is of the Pacific Islands as disappearing, as sinking. Um, I think there are hundreds and thousands of news articles you'll find online of how Tuvalu is sinking, Maldives is sinking, and how this imaginary shapes the materiality of these islands is because it is not possible to imagine that there could also be adaptation. That what do the people want? What do the islanders want? Do they want to move? Do they see themselves as losing their habitat? Or would they prefer adaptation so that they do not have to migrate in the future? And this kind of reduces then the possibility of coming up with alternative solutions because you've already accepted that the islands are sinking. So what say donor or policy organizations would plan would be more in terms of, oh, these people will need to be relocated. So let's think of planned retreat. So already kind of minimizing the opportunities, the alternatives there are to think about the situation, right? And there's very interesting work by Carol Farbotko in this context, and she looks at how there's very little debate on how what the islanders want, but more and more debate on how, international adaptation agencies and all the decision makers who are in the global north, how do they do a financial cost benefit analysis of, what needs to be done once the islands have sunk. And she also calls this almost wishful thinking. It's almost as if the decision makers in the global north wish for this island to sink because that would kind of confirm their imaginaries of climate change. And just to kind of build on that concept, so I have started to work on spatio-scientific imaginaries because for me, like these spatial imaginaries not only situate migration in space, thereby creating an object that we then need to study, but they also simultaneously frame the global north as a speciality of scientific knowledge and problem solving. So by locating the problem in the global south, we are also creating the global north, and of course, using these terms kind of very loosely here. We're also creating the global north as a space then where scientific solutions emerge, where technological and techno-managerial solutions can be found to these very problems. And so once we start to look at these specialities as imaginaries of both space as well as science, it also alerts us to different questions then, that where are the epistemic geographies of climate migration located? Where is the field vis-a-vis epistemic sites such as labs and conferences where climate models are discussed, where climate future migrations are discussed? Where are knowledge infrastructures, that is, networks of institutions, artifacts, technology that produce, circulate, and maintain certain forms of knowledge? So, which is why, again, going back to the last slide, like while geographies of climate migration would kind of presume factuality, I feel like using the term spatio-scientific imaginaries, or rather the lens of spatio-scientific imaginaries, lets us look at how certain spatial assumptions are turned into facts through representation, through circulation, and then through material intervention. And what this also does is kind of historicizes these spatial imaginaries because they are not something that have emerged just in the present. Very often they have, you can trace like historical continuities of such imaginaries and how they intersect with culture and power. So again, going back to the example of the island, you have to, I mean, if you want to think of it kind of as a historical imaginary, you can think of the island laboratory trope. So there was always this idea that because islands are remote, they're isolated, they are bounded, they're very clearly bounded and demarcated geographies, that they can also act as absolute spaces of knowledge. So historically, anthropologists, epidemiologists, natural scientists, they have treated islands as like this kind of perfect field site, perfect laboratory where you can make knowledge. And this has gone hand in hand with all the different experiments that have been conducted on islands, from phosphate mining to nuclear test to military interventions. And if you start to think of the island imaginary as the same historical continuity, you also begin to understand better this idea that of Carol Farbotko's idea on wishful thinking, that because all Western anxieties about climate change are kind of centered on these little islands, they're almost like acting as laboratories at this point, where if they were to sink in the future, then that would almost confirm what we know in the West about climate change. And this kind of really tends to not take into account the people that live there and their desires, whether they wish to move, whether they are attached to their land, whether they would prefer adaptation measures so that they do not have to move. And not just the people, but sometimes there's often scientific evidence to the contrary. There's also scientific evidence that islands are not static land masses. So when islands lose land, they also simultaneously gain land, which means that we can have very much different spatial imaginaries, but the dominant ones always make sure that the contesting ones are not given the same kind of space or importance, right? Yeah. And as I said, that I prefer to think of the spatial and the scientific imaginaries together because often they go hand in hand, right? So we see that certain specialities are the spaces of climate migration, kind of coterminously also then projecting the global north as a space of knowledge, as a space where this knowledge is produced, the solutions are, these discussions and debates happen, and the potential solutions are thought about. And just to show you a few slides about this project at the University of Neuchâtel by Etienne Piguet and his colleagues. I think they studied case studies on climate migration for over 50 years. I mean, they didn't study it for 50 years, but they took into account 50 years worth of studies on climate change and migration. And they kind of made these graphs on where do you see, sorry, maps on where do you see the world's most case studies. So the location of case studies vis-a-vis the origin of the authors, vis-a-vis the origin of the funding for these cases, right? So there's something very illustrative that you see here. So yeah, just take a minute to have a look at where are the world's case studies located, and you'll see that, I mean, this is from 2018. We are many years ahead of it now, and now I would say that it's very easy to spot this pattern where most of the studies of climate change and climate migration happen in Africa, because somehow the accepted wisdom, and this is why I signed the second reading, like this accepted wisdom seems to be that Africa is the global hotspot of climate migration. And predictably, when you see where the case studies authors originate, you'll see that most of them originate in US and Europe. And then also you see the funding. The funding for these case studies comes from, you can see the European Commission being actually one of the biggest funders of these studies on climate migration. And so yeah, this again tells you about like the spatio-scientific imaginaries that I discussed earlier. Oh, this is just a cat picture for you to take a breather before we move on to the the nicer part. So not to end this discussion with, well, all this is wrong with the field, but to say that there are also good ways of producing knowledge in the field. And after you have looked at the cat, we'll move on to that. Okay. So I think I've come almost to the last part of my presentation where I'll look at what are the kind of more hopeful ways or more complex and nuanced ways of producing knowledge in this field. And one of them is this development towards climate mobilities. So moving away from kind of looking at this grand singular event called as climate migration to kind of looking at climate mobilities as this framework that lets you see the relationship between climate change and migration as often indirect, small, and taking shape in context-specific ways, influenced by a host of other socio-economic political factors. And what climate mobilities lets you do is also pay attention to the multiplicity of this relationship, right? So this relationship can manifest in the form of immobility. Like when we think of climate migration, we also need to think of immobilities, situations where people cannot move or people do not want to move. We can think about planned relocation. We can think of circular mobility, short-term migration, even short-term displacement to shelters in the face of disasters. So there are so many different kinds of long-term, short-term, voluntary, forced movements and lack of movements that are part of this whole gamut of the relationship between climate change and migration. And climate mobilities is a framework that kind of lets you see that. So yeah, and increasingly, as you can see, this is 2022, so very recent framework. And increasingly in the last few years, scholars are calling for attention to the more subtle, the more everyday, and complex relationships between different scales and different types of mobilities and ecological change. I also would like to talk a bit about what would a climate and mobility justice perspective look like. And here I prefer to actually use the term environmental justice to climate justice because climate justice often kind of seems very concentrated on carbon and I think we need to look at the issue a bit more broadly, and where this framework of environmental justice helps us look at the entanglement of environmental issues, poverty, and marginalizations, right? So it lets you question that why is it that people who are exposed to other forms of disadvantage are also often the ones that face more environmental harm? And here, this is a bit different to the dominant discourse of vulnerability that you often encounter in the field, because just by saying that, oh, people in the global south are more vulnerable to climate change, or people in Africa are more vulnerable to climate change, it often does not let you question the structural injustices that create that vulnerability, the historical injustices that create that vulnerability, but kind of present vulnerability as some sort of an innate character of certain populations in certain parts of the world, right? But as opposed to that, environmental justice lets you see, or rather lets you question and investigate that why is it that the poorer the people are, the more exposed they are to environmental harms, or racialized people or black people are more exposed to environmental harms, or indigenous people are more exposed to environmental harms. And that kind of also lets you historicize this, right? And kind of question the role of racial capitalism and coloniality in all of this. And then you can also look at it through the lens of mobility justice, where we have to keep asking ourselves that whose mobility is a problem, right? So corporations that pollute or corporations that often cause displacement are able to move freely around the world, while people that get affected are not. And there are also certain assumptions here that are into play and in circulation all the time. That, when you think of poor people from the global south, you think of them as rather static. So these are people that somehow are very rooted to the ground and they're not supposed to move as much as wealthy white Europeans. So, like the idea of the EU, where people can move freely without any borders, vis-a-vis poor people in the global south that are somehow not supposed to move. So their mobility immediately becomes a problem, even if they are choosing to move in the face of the effects of climate change. Somehow their mobility is more likely to be constructed as a problem. And I think it's also very important to remember here that people move all the time. Like people move for all sorts of reasons. They move seasonally, they move temporarily, they move permanently for work, for education, for family, or even for adventure, right? So constructing the mobility of people as a problem, I think, is kind of one of the assumptions that lies at the core of understanding climate mobility as a problem. So when we start to look at it through the lens of environmental and mobility justice, I think it lets us imagine a bit differently. Um, so just to kind of end my presentation, I have come up with three suggestions for how to produce good knowledge, because it's not enough to point out all the problems with the current knowledge production in this field, right? But also to be able to offer certain constructive suggestions in that regard. And for me, I think it's very important to be able to historicize as well as politicize the problem, right? So the way the most literature on climate migration is right now, it's rather ahistorical and it's rather apolitical. And we need to infuse both kind of historicity, yeah, and make it more political. And how to do that? I think one of the suggestions would be to avoid presentism. So to take a more kind of longue durée approach to see the nexus of human mobilities and ecological changes in a very broad temporal perspective at different levels and across different historical periods. So this also lets you kind of de-exceptionalize mobility. You realize when you look at the history of mobilities in a place, you also realize that people have moved across time periods and for different reasons, and hence if they are also moving because of ecological changes, maybe there's nothing so exceptional about that, that it needs to be created as a problem. The second suggestion would be also to think of migration regimes. That while it's all good to say that, mobility is part of life and we need not problematize it, at the same time, we also know how legal categories and global racial hierarchies have always kind of limited mobility of certain people, right, and certain geographies. So to think in terms of migration regimes that then create these labels of whose mobility is okay and whose is not. And the third suggestion would be to take a political ecology approach, which means that you consider the role of political economy alongside the access and the rights to natural resources. So often, when you look very deeply into climate migration, you'll find that it goes back to the rights to land, the rights to livelihood, the rights to access to forests for indigenous communities. And it's not very productive to think of climate migration as some abstract notion that can be explained without talking about people's right to natural resources, their relationship with their land and with livelihood. And this also helps you politicize the issue because then that lets you kind of fix accountability. That when you see that a community has to move because they cannot access the forest that they're dependent on for their livelihood, you can fix accountability then. Who's responsible? What is the role of the state? As opposed to kind of projecting climate migration as some sort of global problem, which then has to be dealt somehow globally, which often is very abstract, right? So yeah, take a long durée view, think in terms of migration regimes, and look more deeply and intently at political ecologies of migration, political economies of migration. Yeah, and then I have the two questions here, which I thought you could reflect on. So I hope that when I spoke about the production of migration, it kind of was clear to you in terms of what are we trying to do here by taking distance from the phenomenon and saying that migration cannot be known outside of the ways of studying it? And how do you think it lets you understand better the phenomenon of climate migration? And then thinking in terms of spatial or spatio-scientific imaginaries, is that useful? Is that not useful? Can you think of more examples that you might have encountered in academic literature or in popular media of these kind of imaginaries of migration? So these would be my two questions that you could take the time to reflect on. And yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for this great talk and for mapping the field for us. I think this really there's a lot in the talk that's to discuss. Now the rest of the session will follow us. The Ellen is going to create some small groups, like breakout rooms, for students who take this lecture series also as a course. And then students will have around like 20 minutes to discuss your questions and also the readings that you have assigned. And then we will meet again here at 12:20 for a plenary discussion. So, and then can you maybe help me to create breakout rooms for students?
Yes, but maybe just to add that we tend to take just a very, very brief 5 minutes, a very, very brief 5-minute break, just to ensure that everyone who are staying are the students taking the course. So everyone gets a few minutes breather.
Sorry, Ellen. So then we come back here at 12:20.
No, sorry. Yeah, you will.
Oh, me, yeah.
I was going to
Okay.
say, but the students will be back. I mean, yeah, we can give them till 3 minutes past or something, and everyone can come back.
And
But
those,
now,
yeah.
oh, sorry.
I think there are also some guests kind of listening the lecture. So, and those who are interested in hearing the discussion later, so you can also stay, of course. Like it's
Yeah.
now there will be around like 20 minutes for students to discuss in breakout rooms.
Yes.
But I see some colleagues also from Osnabrück, like
Oh yeah. They can
they're more than
absolutely
welcome
stay.
to stay in the
Yeah.
room and join the
Absolutely.
discussion.
But Mart, because now you are the host.
Okay, so how do I do it? Breakout rooms, assign
Yeah.
6, 5, 6, 5,
5. Yeah.
5 plus we have Salzburg and Paris. I think I would say
Exactly.
we do 4, I think. Then we have 2 on-site groups anyway.
Yeah. And what I've done each time is to divide them into the groups or assign them into the groups just alphabetically. So then, because then it kind of makes sure that a lot of the students will be in the same groups-ish.
Okay.
Because I know this was a concern for some
And
students
I have
that were
to assign manually, right? In this case.
exactly, because
Create.
otherwise you'll get all the coordinators, everything. So you need to do it manually, unfortunately.
Assign exactly. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7.
So you can just kind of drag them into, yeah.
2, 3. And then I created rooms now, like 4 rooms. And I accidentally put 2 coordinators in rooms, so I don't know how to remove them.
Can you not press the name and just, oh no.
No.
Oh.
But it's for your info, like for Camille and Antia, you will now join 2 rooms, but please.
They can just
It
leave
was
the
a
room.
mistake. Okay, you just leave the room.
Yeah.
Okay,
do
then I
that.
start the rooms too.
Mm.
Sorry about it. Now the
This
rooms
is a
are
whole science in itself,
yeah,
soup management.
exactly 5 years after COVID still.
Yeah.
And we are meeting again at 12:20.
I think you can open the.
I did.
Open. Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, we're just waiting for them to
Accept.
Yeah. And it would be good math as well, because I think there's been some confusion regarding this, just to remind the students to write and send in the notes from the discussions.
Yeah, I have to check the details, or maybe you can do it because I do the session together with my students on site.
Yeah.
That's why I don't need it. And I really pay
Yeah.
attention to that.
No, I
But
understand. I forgot about it at my
yeah,
first session as well, and I think the various chairs have forgotten as well, and it's
okay.
so. But I'm trying to stick to
Yeah,
it at least.
yeah. And can you finish the recording?
Oh yeah, God, yeah.